She walked into the armory carrying a trauma kit, and 43 Navy SEALs laughed at her. They were still laughing 60 seconds later when she had a Barrett M82A1 field stripped down to components on the table in front of her, blindfolded, from memory, in under 45 seconds. The laughter stopped. Nobody in that room knew her name. Nobody knew her file. Nobody knew that the quiet woman in scrubs they'd spent the last 10 minutes mocking had once put a round through a target at over 3,000 meters in the dark, in the rain, with a dead partner bleeding out beside her. They were about to find out. If this story has you hooked already, follow along with me to the very end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning shift at Harrogate Military Medical Center started the way most mornings did in the trauma wing, badly. A supply cart had been left blocking the corridor outside Bay 4. A junior orderly was arguing with the pharmacy tech about a requisition that had apparently gone missing 3 times in 2 weeks, and the overhead fluorescents in the east hallway had been flickering for 11 days, despite 4 separate maintenance requests. Nurse specialist Mara Voss had noted the flickering lights in the facility log on day 2. She'd noted it again on day 5. On day 9, she'd simply stopped writing it down and started keeping a small LED flashlight in her left breast pocket instead. That was the kind of person she was. She didn't wait for systems to fix themselves. She just adapted quietly and kept moving. Harrogate sat on the edge of Caldwell Base in northern Carith, Virginia, a full-service military installation that housed, among other things, one of the most active naval special warfare training pipelines on the East Coast. The hospital served the base's general population, the training cadres, and the rotating teams of operators who cycled through for pre-deployment medicals, injury rehab, and the occasional trauma case that came in under classification flags nobody on staff was supposed to ask questions about. Mara had been here 14 months. She was 28 years old, she wore her dark hair pulled back in a way that looked functional rather than styled, and she had a habit of standing in doorways for a half-second longer than most people before entering a room, long enough to register what was happening inside before she committed to walking into it. Most of her colleagues had assumed, without ever thinking too hard about it, that this was simply a quiet person's instinct. It wasn't. She'd been doing it since Kandahar, since the summer when she'd learned, in the most permanent and irreversible way available, that knowing what was behind a door before you opened it was the difference between walking back out again and not. But that was a different life. That file was sealed tighter than anything in this hospital, and Mara had not opened it since the day she signed her separation papers and drove away from Fort Delray in a used pickup truck with 90,000 miles on it and a hole in the passenger seat that she'd eventually patched with duct tape and a piece of vinyl cut from a map she didn't need anymore. She was a nurse now. Trauma unit, day shift, occasional float to surgical recovery when they were understaffed. That was the whole story, as far as anyone here was concerned. She was halfway through morning rounds when the request came through. The SEAL team currently occupying the east wing of Caldwell's training facility, Maritime Assault Unit 7, rotating in from their forward deployment, had a scheduled combat medical equipment inspection. Standard protocol required a qualified trauma nurse from the hospital staff to cross-certify the field medical kits, verify drug inventories, and sign off on the combat-ready status of the unit's emergency surgical supplies. It was administrative work, mostly, the kind of task that generated 3 forms and a signature and then disappeared into a filing system nobody ever looked at again. The hospital's senior nurse coordinator, Deb Richter, had flagged the assignment that morning with a look that suggested mild apology. "I know it's not your favorite thing," Deb said, handing Mara the clipboard. Walking over to the SEAL side of the house. "It's fine," Mara said. "They can be—" "I know what they can be, Deb." Deb pressed her lips together. "I'll have someone cover your afternoon rounds." Mara took the clipboard, clipped her access badge to her jacket, and walked out of the trauma wing toward the east corridor that connected the hospital to the training facility's secondary wing. The armory and equipment storage occupied the ground floor of the east annex, a wide, low-ceilinged space that smelled like gun oil, rubber, and the particular kind of institutional cleaner that never quite masked either of those things. When Mara pushed open the door with her shoulder and stepped inside, she counted immediately, without meaning to, 43 personnel. Some were running equipment checks, Some were seated. 4 were standing near the weapons rack at the far end doing something she couldn't immediately identify. What she could identify, within about 4 seconds of being in the room, was the Barrett M82A1 lying on the inspection table near the center of the space. It was disassembled incorrectly. Not dramatically incorrectly. Whoever had started breaking it down knew what they were doing, roughly. But the recoil buffer had been seated wrong, and the bolt carrier group had been placed in the wrong orientation for proper cleaning access. Whoever had done it was either rushing or had learned from someone who'd picked up a small but consistent bad habit and passed it along. Mara noted it and kept walking toward the field medical kit staged near the south wall. She was 3 steps into the room when the first comment arrived. "Somebody order a nurse?" It came from the group near the weapons rack. Not cruel exactly, but carrying that specific tone of easy dismissal that men in this environment sometimes deployed without even really thinking about it. Not a targeted attack, more like a reflex. Mara didn't stop walking. "Medical certification inspection. I'm looking for the field kit staging area. Down the end, past the armory cage." A different voice, more neutral. Someone pointing. "Thanks." She was almost to the south wall when the footsteps came up behind her. Heavier, unhurried, with the deliberate quality of someone who wanted to be heard approaching. "Hold on." She turned. The man was tall, built the way career operators sometimes got built. Not gym bulk, but the kind of durable, load-bearing density that came from years of carrying weight in bad conditions. He had a commander's insignia on his collar and the expression of someone who had decided something before he'd finished walking over. "This is a secured operational space," he said. "What's your authorization level?" Mara held up her access badge and the clipboard. "Nurse Specialist Mara Voss, Harrogate Trauma Unit. I'm here for the pre-deployment medical kit certification. It's been scheduled since Tuesday." The commander, she would learn his name later, Garrett Mullen, 7 years in naval special warfare, currently assigned as unit commander for MAU-7, looked at the badge the way some people look at a parking ticket. Present, acknowledged, already being dismissed. "That certification is supposed to go through our unit medic." Your unit medic submitted the request to hospital administration. Per protocol, an independent trauma nurse has to sign off on drug inventory and surgical supply readiness. It's not optional. "I'm aware of what the protocol says." He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm also aware that this is a live operational equipment space, and I have final authority over who moves through it. So I'm asking you again, what's your clearance level?" "I'm a civilian medical staff member with base access authorization, Commander. My clearance level is sufficient for this inspection." Somewhere behind her someone laughed, low, not very loud, but she heard it. Mullen crossed his arms. "I've got operators running live prep in here. Last thing I need is someone who's going to be tripping over hardware they've never seen before." "I won't be in your operator's way. That's not really the point." "Then what is?" The question landed flat and direct, and something shifted slightly in the room. Not much, just enough. Mullen's jaw tightened. "The point is that I don't know you. I wasn't briefed on this inspection, and I'm not comfortable with unvetted personnel wandering through my equipment space. So I'm going to ask you to wait outside while I make a call." Mara held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "That's your prerogative, Commander." She turned to go. She was passing the inspection table, the one with the Barrett on it, when she stopped. She wasn't sure afterward exactly what made her do it. It might have been 14 months of quiet. It might have been the laugh she'd heard behind her. It might have been something more simple. Just the fact that the rifle was disassembled wrong, and leaving it wrong felt like leaving a fracture untreated, and she'd never been able to do that. She set her clipboard down on the edge of the table. "Who was working on this?" she asked. No one answered immediately. "The Barrett," she said. "It's been broken down wrong. The recoil buffer is seated incorrectly, and the BCG orientation is going to give you incomplete cleaning access. If someone's running a qualification with this rifle, they should know that." The room had gone slightly quieter. "Lady." One of the operators near the rack, young, maybe 24, with the particular confidence of someone who hadn't been wrong about enough things yet, took a step forward. "Do you even know what a BCG is?" Mara looked at the rifle. Then she looked at him. Bolt carrier group, she said. And the reason yours is seated that way is because whoever taught you to break this down didn't emphasize the rotation step. So you've been doing it slightly wrong every time and never noticed because it still functions. But if you're pushing this weapon through high-volume rounds in a high-heat environment and you haven't been getting complete cleaning access, you're going to see extraction failures at the worst possible moment. The young operator stared at her. Mara picked up the bolt carrier group, rotated it correctly, reseated it, and began reassembling the rifle with the particular quality of attention that didn't look like showing off because it wasn't. It was just accuracy. The components moved the way they were supposed to move, each one settling into place with the kind of certainty that only came from doing something so many times that it stopped being a sequence of steps and became a single, continuous motion. 41 seconds. She set the reassembled Barrett back on the table. The room was completely quiet. Commander Mullen hadn't moved. His arms were still crossed, but something in the set of his face had changed. Not softened exactly. More like recalibrated. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "I was Army," Mara said. "Before the hospital." "What MOS?" 68 Whiskey. Combat medic. It was true, as far as it went, and it was all she offered. Mullen looked at the rifle, looked at her. Combat medics don't usually have that kind of familiarity with a .50 caliber. "Some do," she said. She picked up her clipboard and walked to the south wall to start the medical kit inspection. She heard him say something behind her, low enough that she didn't catch the words, and heard a couple of responses, also low. She didn't look back. The field medical kits were, for the most part, in acceptable condition. She worked through them methodically, checking drug inventories against the manifest, verifying expiration dates, inspecting surgical supply packaging for seal integrity, noting discrepancies on her clipboard. It was quiet work and she was good at it, and for about 20 minutes the room simply continued around her the way rooms do when they've decided someone isn't worth monitoring anymore. She was on Kit 4 when Mullen came back. "I made some calls," he said. "Okay." "The inspection was scheduled. I confirmed that." "I know. I also, He stopped, started again differently. "I want to be straight with you. I don't like having unknowns in my operational space. That's not a personal thing. That's a command posture." "I understand command posture," Mara said, without looking up from the kit. "I'm sure you do." He was quiet for a moment. "What theater?" She looked up then. "Afghanistan," she said. "2 tours. Forward operating?" "When it was necessary." He studied her, not hostilely, just with the specific attentiveness of someone who was revising something. "The Barrett thing. That wasn't 68 Whiskey training." "No," she agreed. "So?" "So I picked things up." It wasn't a satisfying answer and she knew it. But it was the answer she was giving, and after a moment he seemed to accept that it was the only one coming. He left her to finish the inspection. She was sealing the last kit, signing the certification form, when the young operator from earlier, the one she'd corrected on the BCG, appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision. He stood there in that particular way of someone who wants to say something and hasn't figured out how to start. "Hey," he said finally. She looked up. "I looked it up," he said. The rotation step. A pause. "You were right." Mara nodded. "I know." He almost smiled. "Yeah." He scuffed his boot slightly against the floor. "Sorry about earlier, the comment." "It's okay." "It's not, really." She held his gaze for a moment. He was young. He'd figure out what he didn't know yet, or he wouldn't, but right now he was standing here admitting to something small, and it cost him something to do it, and she could see that. "Get your team lead to walk through the BCG orientation before your next qualification run," she said. "Don't let it carry forward." "Yes, ma'am." She finished signing the form, clipped it to the clipboard, and turned to go. She had almost reached the door when Commander Mullen's voice came across the room again. Not directed at her, or not exactly, but pitched to Carrie. "Qualification range is open tomorrow morning, 0600, running our sniper research." She stopped. "You're welcome to observe," he said. There was something in his tone she couldn't quite categorize. Not entirely an invitation, not entirely not. "I've got a shift," she said. "I'll coordinate with Richter." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression she'd learned to recognize over years of working in environments where testing was a permanent state of existence. It wasn't hostile. It was evaluative. He wanted to see something, and he was positioning the circumstance to see it. She knew exactly what it was going to look like from the outside when she showed up at that range tomorrow. She also knew what she was going to do when she got there. 0600, she said. 0600, he confirmed. She pushed through the door and walked back across the corridor toward the hospital, and she did not let any of what she was feeling show on her face until she was 3 hallways away and alone. And then it was only a single long exhale through her nose. Controlled, quiet, and final. She'd spent 14 months being invisible. Tomorrow that was going to change, and she hadn't decided yet whether she was ready for what came after. The range at Caldwell Base was a compressed rectangle of cleared land that stretched 800 meters from the firing line to the farthest target bank, with a crosswind that came off the tree line from the northeast between 0530 and 0800, variable between 3 and 7 knots, before it died down and left the air flat and thick the way Virginia mornings got in the summer. Mara was there at 0550, not because she was anxious, because she'd learned a long time ago that being in a space before other people put you in it taught you things you couldn't learn after the room was full. The range safety officer, a senior petty officer named Horace Tully, gray at the temples, with the perpetually unimpressed expression of someone who'd watched too many people be certain about things they had no business being certain about, checked her in at the gate without comment. "Specialist Voss?" "That's me." "Commander Mullen said to put you in Lane 4. Lane 4 was in the middle of the line. Not a place of honor, not a place of humiliation. The kind of placement that said nothing at all, which told her everything about how this was being framed. Officially neutral, with space to see what developed. The MAU-7 operators arrived at 0600 in that loose, purposeful cluster that special operations teams moved in. Not quite formation, not quite casual, something in between. 12 shooters today, she counted, plus Mullen and 2 other senior personnel standing back at the observation line. There were also, she noticed, 6 additional people she didn't recognize. Officers, by their bearing. Not from this unit. She filed that and didn't react to it. The recert qualification involved 5 shots at 500 meters, 5 shots at 600, and a final 5 at 800. Standard long-range sniper requalification. The weapons were issued from the range armory. 3 Barrett M82A1s, 2 MK21 precision sniper rifles, and what she was fairly sure was a CSASS based on the case profile, though she couldn't confirm that without seeing it out of the box. She was given a Barrett. The operator who handed it to her, a senior chief with a quiet face and cautious eyes, didn't say anything when he gave it to her. But he watched how she took it, and she knew he was watching, and she took it correctly because that was the only way she knew how to take it. The qualification round began. She waited her turn without speaking. The operators around her ran their relays with the particular controlled efficiency of people who'd been doing this long enough that competence was just the baseline, and what they were actually measuring was consistency. She heard once a comment from somewhere down the line, not close enough to make out the words, but close enough to understand the tone. Mullen didn't react to it visibly, neither did she. When her relay was called, she settled into lane 4, 800 meters. The crosswind had shifted to 4 knots from the north-northeast, which meant a right-to-left drift of approximately 1.7 MOA at this distance with this round. She made the adjustment without looking away from the sight picture. She breathed. The range was quiet. She could feel it. The quality of attention that had settled over the observation line without anyone deciding to pay attention. The particular silence of people watching something they didn't expect to watch. She fired the first round. Center. Not close to center. Not near center. The kind of center that meant she'd accounted for every variable correctly on the first attempt, which was either luck or it wasn't. She fired the second round. Center. The third, fourth, fifth. She lowered the rifle. Horace Tully called the targets through his radio. His voice was professionally flat, and she would have appreciated that under different circumstances. Right now she was counting the seconds between when he called the results and when the observation line reacted. There were about 2 seconds. Then Commander Mullen said something she couldn't hear from here, and one of the unknown officers said something back. And then there was a very specific kind of quiet that she recognized. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of people trying to figure out what they were looking at. She picked up the Barrett and set it on the shooting mat and waited for the next relay with her hands loose in her lap and her expression showing nothing at all. She was on her third relay, 800 meters again, final string, when the sirens started. Not base alarm sirens. Medical sirens. The acute emergency tone from Harrogate Medical Center, which she recognized by pitch and pattern because she'd spent 14 months conditioning herself to recognize it the way she'd once conditioned herself to recognize mortar trajectories by sound. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Mass casualty protocol activated. Harrogate trauma. All available medical personnel respond immediately. She was already on her feet when Mullen's radio crackled, and the voice coming through it said something that made 3 of the unknown officers at the observation line move simultaneously in a way that had nothing to do with the mass casualty alert. It had to do with her. She saw one of them, a colonel, silver oak leaves on the collar, pull out a separate radio and speak into it with the urgency of someone who had just received information they'd been waiting to receive, and had not expected to receive quite this soon. She didn't know what that meant yet. She slung the Barrett over her shoulder and started toward the gate at a run, and behind her she heard Mullen's voice cut clearly across the range. "Everyone hold! Nobody moves until I say so." And underneath that, the colonel's voice on the radio, clear enough to catch 4 words before the wind took the rest of it. "Confirm. She's here." Mara kept running. Whatever was waiting for her at Harrogate had just gotten significantly more complicated, and she could feel it. The specific cold weight of a past that doesn't stay buried no matter how quietly you bury it, settling back into place across her shoulders like a ruck she'd never really set down. The trauma wing doors were 40 meters ahead. She hit them at full speed. The trauma wing doors swung shut behind her, and the sound of the sirens hit her full in the chest. Not loud exactly, but layered, the way institutional alarms always were, each tone carrying a different meaning to people trained to hear the difference. She read the room in the first 3 seconds. Bay 1, 2 nurses and a resident working a chest wound, stable, controlled. Bay 2, empty. Bay 3, a curtain drawn, someone crying behind it. Not emergency crying, grief crying, which meant they were past the acute phase. The nursing station at the center of the wing had 4 people clustered around it, 2 of them on phones, 1 pulling a crash cart, 1, Deb Richter, her face set in the particular expression of someone managing 6 things simultaneously and not dropping any of them, pointing at a corridor map spread across the desk. Voss. Deb saw her and didn't waste time on surprise. Trauma Bay 4, GSW, 2 patients, 1 critical, 1 serious. Dr. Ferris is already in there. He needs a second qualified set of hands. On it. Mara was already moving, stripping off her jacket, reaching for the glove box on the wall. What's the weapon? Handgun. 9mm, we think. 1 round in the thoracic cavity, 1 in the abdomen. Separate patients? Same patient. 2 entry wounds. Deb's voice didn't waver. The second one we didn't catch on intake. Mara pushed through the Bay 4 door. The room smelled like blood and antiseptic in the specific ratio that meant someone had already been working in here for several minutes. Dr. Ferris, mid-40s, competent, the kind of doctor who got better under pressure rather than worse, was elbow deep in the thoracic wound, his eyes tracking vitals on the monitor above him without looking like he was doing it. Voss, abdominal wound, right lateral. The probe is on the tray. Tell me what we've got. She was already at the second site. The wound was small entrance, which meant the round had slowed before impact or was a lower velocity load. Either way, the internal damage was the question. She picked up the probe. Entry approximately 4 centimeters right of midline, below the rib margin, she said, running through it fast and steady. Palpation suggests. She pressed carefully. The patient, a male in his 30s, with the gray pallor of someone losing pressure fast, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Possible hepatic involvement. I need imaging. Can't move him yet. Then I need a portable. Already called. They worked. The room contracted to the specific dimensions of the task. Tray, patient, monitor, the back and forth of two people who'd never worked a trauma together before, finding the rhythm that every trauma team found or didn't find in the first 4 minutes. And this one they found because Ferris was good and Mara was better than he knew she was, and neither of them had to explain themselves to the other. She had the abdominal bleed stabilized, packed, pressure applied, vitals climbing back towards something manageable, when she became aware that there were people in the corridor outside the bay who had no medical reason to be there. She registered this the way she registered most peripheral things. Noted, filed, not allowed to distract. Ferris called the thoracic wound closed 12 minutes in. They moved the patient to imaging together. Mara stripped her gloves, washed her hands at the bay sink, and stepped out into the corridor. Commander Mullen was standing there. He had changed out of his range gear and was in his service uniform now, which meant he'd had time to do that, which meant he hadn't come here immediately after she left the range, which meant something had happened in the interval that she didn't have information about yet. The colonel with the silver oak leaves was standing 6 feet behind him. "Specialist Voss," Mullen said. "Commander." She looked at the colonel without recognition she was willing to show. "Can this wait? I'm in the middle of a—" "The mass casualty alert has been downgraded," the colonel said. His voice was measured in a way that suggested it was always measured, even when things were going badly, possibly especially then. "The 2 GSW patients were the extent of the incident. Your team has it covered." "What incident?" Mullen and the colonel exchanged something. Not a look exactly, more like a small mutual acknowledgement that a conversation was starting that couldn't be restarted once it began. "There was a situation at the East Gate," Mullen said. "An altercation. It's being handled by base security." "That's not what the mass casualty protocol is for." "No," the colonel said. "It isn't. The protocol was activated as a precaution." He paused. "And to get you back here quickly." Mara looked at him. "To get me back here," she repeated. "Yes." She waited. "My name is Colonel Artis Webb," he said. "I'm with the Joint Special Operations Medical Command. I've been at Caldwell Base for the past 18 hours. He held her gaze without the particular kind of effort that people put into holding eye contact when they're managing what they show. He was just looking at her directly, the way people did when they'd already decided something. "I was at the range this morning because I received information yesterday that suggested you might be stationed here. I wanted to confirm that before I made contact through official channels." The corridor was not especially quiet. Harrogate never was. But the noise around them had the quality of background, present but not penetrating, and the space between the three of them had a different texture than the space around it. "You could have looked at the staff roster," Mara said. "The name Mara Voss isn't in any system I have access to," Webb said, which is itself a piece of information. She said nothing. Mullen cleared his throat. It was the first time she'd seen him look slightly uncomfortable, which was an interesting thing to see. "I was informed this morning," he said, "that the clearance level issue I raised yesterday was not the right frame." "Not the right frame," she repeated. "I owe you an apology for how you were received in the equipment space." She looked at him for a moment. "Okay. I mean that seriously." "I know you do." She turned back to Webb. "What do you want, Colonel?" "Not here," he said. "Is there somewhere quiet?" She took them to the small consultation room off the nursing station, a room barely large enough for 3 chairs and a table, with a single narrow window that looked out onto the parking structure. She didn't sit. Neither did Webb. Mullen stood near the door with his arms at his sides and the expression of someone who understood he was in a room where something was happening that he only partially had the context for. Webb put a folder on the table. He didn't open it. "I'm not going to ask you to confirm or deny anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. What's in this folder is information I already have, and I'm not using this conversation to establish it. I'm using this conversation to ask you a question, and the question is simple." Mara looked at the folder. The tab on it was red. She'd seen red tab folders before, and she knew what the color indicated, and she kept her breathing even and her face neutral, and she waited. "There's a situation developing," Webb said. "I can't give you specifics in this setting. What I can tell you is that it involves personnel and capabilities that are in very short supply, and that your name, one of your names, came up in a context that suggested you might be relevant. I'm a trauma nurse, Mara said. You are, Webb agreed. Among other things. The silence stretched. You shot 5 for 5 at 800 meters this morning, Mullen said from behind her. His voice was quiet and had none of the edge it had carried yesterday. Iron sight final string. I've been running qualification ranges for 6 years. I've seen that score twice. She didn't respond to that. The folder's yours to look at, Webb said. I'm not requiring anything. I'm not ordering anything. I'm here because a situation is developing and the people who know your full record believe you're relevant to it, and they asked me to make contact and find out if you were willing to have a conversation. What kind of situation? The kind that doesn't stay contained once it starts moving. She looked at the folder. Then she looked at Webb. If I open that, she said, what happens next? That depends entirely on you. She put her hand flat on the folder. She didn't open it, not yet. She just stood there with her palm on the cover and felt the weight of everything on the other side of it. Not the paper, which was nothing, but the accumulated mass of choices that had led to this specific room and this specific moment, and the fact that a colonel from JSOMEC had spent 18 hours at Caldwell Base waiting to confirm she existed. Give me 20 minutes, she said. I need to check on my patients. Take what you need, Webb said. She left the folder on the table. She walked back to Bay 4, checked the updated imaging report that had come through in her absence, updated her notes, spoke briefly to Ferris about the hepatic situation, and then stood at the bay sink for a moment with the water running and her hands still and the sound of the hospital around her doing what hospitals did, continuing, regardless. 14 months. She'd been a nurse for 14 months in this building, and before that She turned off the water. She went back to the consultation room and opened the folder. It took her 4 minutes to read through it. She read it the way she read everything that mattered. Once, carefully, without going back. Because going back meant you hadn't been paying attention the first time, and she was always paying attention the first time. When she finished, she closed it and pushed it back across the table toward Webb. The operation in the Corval Valley, she said. That's what this is about. Webb nodded. The debrief from that mission was sealed. It was. So how is this? There's been a FOIA request, Webb said, not filed by a journalist, filed by a congressional oversight office, specific, targeted, and unusually well-informed about what to ask for. Mara sat down. It was the first time she'd sat since entering the room, and she did it without really deciding to. When? 6 weeks ago. The request is working its way through. It will surface material that, when read without context, could be significantly misrepresented. Who's representing it? We don't know yet. He leaned forward. What we know is that someone with knowledge of that mission's classified details has been cooperating with the oversight office. Not everything. Enough. She thought about that. The Corval Valley operation had been one of 4 missions she'd been attached to during her second tour that didn't officially exist. 3 of them had gone the way those things went when they went well, which was to say nobody ever heard about them, and everyone came home. The 4th had not gone well. The 4th had gone the way a mission went when the intelligence was wrong and the extraction was compromised, and you ended up making decisions in a culvert in the dark that you could defend to yourself, but that would look, without context, like something else entirely. What's the ask? She said. A formal debrief. On record, with JSOMEC legal present. Your account, your documentation, your version of what happened in that valley. I gave a debrief. You gave a classified debrief that cannot be cited in response to a congressional inquiry without declassifying material that would compromise 3 other ongoing operations. Then declassify it. That decision is above my authority. He held her gaze. What is within my authority is to initiate a second debrief process that generates a parallel record which can be cited. But it requires your voluntary participation. Mara was quiet for a moment. And if I don't participate? Webb didn't look away. Then the only version of that mission that enters the record is the one being constructed by whoever is cooperating with the oversight office. She absorbed that. She thought about the culvert. She thought about Specialist Terrano, who'd been the team's sniper, and who'd taken 2 rounds in the first 30 seconds of the compromised extraction, And about the 14 minutes after that, during which she had done the things she'd done, and made the calls she'd made, and put rounds downrange in the dark until the people she was responsible for were either safe or past being saved. She thought about the debrief afterward, the sealed room, the men in it who had told her that what she'd done in that culvert was a level of classified that would follow her. Protect her, they'd said, but also follow her for the rest of her career. She thought about what it would mean for that record to be written by someone else. "I need a lawyer present," she said. "Already arranged." She looked at him. "You were confident I'd agree." "No," he said. "I was prepared for the possibility." He stood. "There's something else." She waited. "The situation I mentioned earlier, the one I said was developing." He picked up the folder. "It's not developing anymore. It started this morning, and it's not on a foreign base." She stared at him. "It's here," he said. "Caldwell. We're getting reports out of the East Medical Annex." From the corridor outside the consultation room, Mullen's radio crackled with a burst of static, and then a voice, urgent, stripped of protocol, the voice of someone transmitting because they had to, and not because they'd composed what they wanted to say. And the words it carried hit the small room like something thrown against a wall. "Base security, we have an unresponsive subject in the East Annex stairwell and a reported armed individual in the Harrogate trauma wing. I repeat, armed individual inside the hospital. All units respond." Webb and Mullen were already moving. Mara was already ahead of them. She didn't wait for the person behind her to close the distance. She went left, into the shelving unit, not away from it, because the person behind her would expect her to go for the door, and because the shelving gave her cover, and because in a confined space with two threat vectors, the worst position was the open center where both of them had a clear line to her simultaneously. The unit rocked when her shoulder hit it. Files cascaded off the edge of the second shelf, manila folders fanning across the concrete floor. She was already moving past it, deeper into the room, putting the first row of shelving between herself and Stahl and buying the 2 seconds she needed to assess what was behind her. The person in the doorway was male, heavy-set, in civilian clothes, not military by his posture, not security by his hesitation. He had a weapon in his right hand, but he hadn't raised it yet, which meant he hadn't been given a specific order yet, which meant Stahl was still the decision-maker in this room, and the man in the door was waiting for direction. That was useful information. "You don't have to make this worse," Stahl said. He hadn't moved from the center shelf. The object in his hand, she could see it clearly now, a compact semi-automatic, smaller than what security typically carried, was pointed at the floor rather than at her, which was either because he hadn't decided to use it yet, or because he was trying to project a version of control that he thought she'd respond to. "How long?" she said, from behind the shelving unit. "What?" "How long have you known I was here?" A pause. "Since your 8th week." 14 months. She'd been visible to him for 13 of them. She thought about that. The morning handoffs, the break room, the committee meetings she'd occasionally been asked to attend as a trauma unit representative, the 3 separate occasions he'd signed documentation that related to her caseload without ever showing a single sign that he was anything other than what he appeared to be. "You're the officer," she said. "From the extraction, the parallel debrief." "I filed an accurate record," he said, and his voice carried the specific indignation of someone who had spent years believing their own justifications. "What happened in that valley was not—" "I know what happened in that valley," she said. "I was there. You made unauthorized tactical decisions that resulted in 6 people going home." She moved along the back wall, staying low, keeping the shelving between them, as opposed to 0. There were protocols. The protocols assumed a functional extraction window, which we didn't have. She stopped moving, listened. The man in the doorway hadn't moved either. She could hear his breathing from here, shallow, fast, the breathing of someone doing something they weren't entirely committed to. "Who's at the door, Raymond?" The use of his first name landed the way she'd intended, not as familiarity, but as a specific kind of pressure. It told him she was calm. It told him she was thinking. It told him this wasn't going the way he'd planned it, and that mattered because men like Stahl, institutional men, men who operated through documentation and process, and the slow machinery of record-keeping, were not comfortable when circumstances moved faster than their plans. Someone who helps me manage situations, Stahl said. Is he going to shoot me? A beat. That's not the intent. That's not an answer. The intent is to contain this until what? Until the FOIA request surfaces, and the manufactured narrative is the only version on record. She moved again 2 steps east along the back wall. The work light in the center of the room created a shadow geometry she was using, knowing where the light didn't reach, using it the way she'd use terrain. You've been in this building for 3 years. You had access to the sealed debrief index. That's how you knew which records to target. I had access to what I was cleared for. And you used it to build a case against the people who survived a mission you wrote a dissenting account of. She paused. What happened, Raymond? Were you embarrassed? Did the sealed debrief make you look like you got the assessment wrong? I got the assessment exactly right. His voice had tightened. What I documented was that an unauthorized combatant, a medical officer operating outside her designated role, made a unilateral tactical decision that should have gone through command authority and didn't. Command authority was dead, she said. Captain LaRue went down in the first exchange. There was no one left above E6. There were protocols for that situation. The protocol for that situation was to wait for extraction confirmation that wasn't coming while 14 people bled out in a culvert. She let that sit. Then, you weren't there, Raymond. You wrote your debrief from the mission logs and the radio transcripts. You weren't in that culvert. Silence. No, he said finally. I wasn't. Then you documented something you didn't see and called it accurate. The man in the doorway shifted. She heard his weight move and tracked it without looking. He'd taken a half step into the room, which meant he was getting uncomfortable with the duration of this standoff and was preparing to move on a signal or on his own initiative, either of which changed the calculus. She needed to move. She needed the file in Stahl's hands. The work light was between her and Stahl, positioned on a rolling cart in the center aisle. She measured the distance, 11 feet to the cart, another 7 to Stahl. The man in the doorway was 18 feet to her left, at roughly her 4 o'clock relative to the room's entry axis. She moved before the calculation was finished, because waiting for a completed calculation in a situation like this was the mistake people made when they'd trained for ranges and not for rooms. She hit the work light cart with her hip, rolling it hard and fast toward the doorway. It wasn't a perfect throw. It didn't hit the man in the door. It went wide left. But it didn't need to hit him. It needed to move and make noise and take his attention for 1.2 seconds, which was what it did. She was already through the center aisle. Stahl brought the weapon up, but she was inside his arm before he'd acquired a sight picture. Not because she was faster, but because she'd been moving while he was still processing, and that gap is larger than people expect when they haven't practiced closing it. She had his weapon hand by the wrist, rotated it outward against the joint, and applied enough pressure that the choice between releasing the weapon and sustaining a fracture was not a difficult one. The weapon hit the floor. She had his collar with her other hand, and the momentum of her forward movement carried both of them hard into the shelving unit behind him. It gave, not collapsed, but buckled enough that they both staggered. He made a sound that was equal parts pain and shock, and the particular indignation of someone who had not, in any of the scenarios he'd constructed for this situation, imagined ending up against a shelving unit with a nurse's hand on his collar. The file, she said. He was still holding it. She took it. The man from the doorway was moving now. She could hear him, fast, committed, the hesitation gone. She released Stahl, stepped back, and turned toward the approach vector with the file held against her chest with one arm and her other hand up. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have a clear path to the door. What she had was a 10-foot ceiling, a row of shelving units, the knowledge that the person coming at her was not a trained operator. His footwork was wrong. His breathing was wrong. He was running rather than moving. And approximately 2 seconds. She grabbed the edge of the shelving unit to her right and pulled. 80 pounds of metal and filing material came down across the center aisle with a sound that was mostly collision and a little bit of everything in it giving way at once. It didn't fall on him. She hadn't intended it to. That wasn't the point. The point was that it fell between them and created a barrier that bought her the 4 seconds she needed to get to the door. She got to the door. She went up the stairs at a run with the file against her chest and came through the service corridor door into the main hospital level, moving fast enough that an orderly with a linen cart startled sideways and said something she didn't catch. She didn't slow down. She was 40 feet from the administration wing when her forward motion was interrupted by Commander Mullen stepping out of a cross corridor with his weapon drawn and then immediately lowering it when he saw who it was. "Voss." "Where the hell?" "Stahl," she said. "Administrative Medical Director, Sublevel 1 Record Storage. He's the breach." She held up the file. "I need Webb. Right now." Mullen looked at the file, looked at her, took in the torn collar of her scrub top, and the fact that she was breathing hard and that there was a scrape along her left forearm that was bleeding in the minor, annoying way of scrapes that happen when you hit a metal edge moving fast. He keyed his radio. "Webb, East Corridor, main level, now." Webb came through the administration wing doors 30 seconds later, and he covered the distance between them fast enough that she understood, watching him move, that whatever he'd been doing in the conference room had not been waiting patiently. "I've been trying to reach you for 8 minutes," he said. "I was occupied." She held out the file. "Corval Parallel Debrief filed by your Administrative Medical Director, Raymond Stahl, who is currently in Sublevel 1 record storage with a civilian associate who is armed. I need base security in that room in the next 3 minutes before they destroy anything else." Webb looked at the file. He took it carefully, the way you took something fragile, and opened it. She watched his face. He read for approximately 45 seconds. His expression did not collapse or widen or perform anything. But something in the set of it changed. A subtle, foundational shift, the kind that happened when a structure's underlying load-bearing calculation turned out to be different from what you'd designed around. "This documents the full extraction sequence," he said. "Yes." "Including your tactical decisions?" "Yes." "And LaRue's status before you took the shot?" "Yes." He closed the file. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been trying to solve a problem from one direction for a long time and has just been shown the direction the problem actually faces. "The shot," he said. "The 3,000-meter engagement. LaRue's sniper was down. The extraction vehicle was taking fire from a ridgeline position at approximately 3,200 meters. The angle was wrong for anyone in the culvert. I was the only one with a line of sight from the position I'd moved to when I went out to get Toronto." She kept her voice flat and even. "I had one round and one opportunity, and I took it. And it worked. And it worked." She held his gaze. "Stahl documented it as unauthorized use of a weapon by a medical officer. What it was the only option available." Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Mullen. "Get me base security on Sublevel 1 immediately. I want Stahl and his associate in custody before either of them touches another piece of paper." Mullen was already on the radio. Webb turned back to her. "The FOIA filing. If Stahl orchestrated it, it was manufactured to create pressure," she said. "The caller told me that before the line went dead. Someone tipped me that Stahl was in that room. Someone who knew Stahl and knew this building and had been tracking the document trail." "The caller's identity?" "He said he was in the culvert." She paused. "He knew things that weren't in any record I've seen. He knew about Toronto by name." Webb absorbed that. Didn't pursue it immediately, which was the right instinct. That thread needed to be pulled carefully and not in a corridor. "The debrief I asked you to provide," he said. "It's still necessary, but the context has changed." "The context has changed significantly." "Yes." He looked at the file in his hands. "This document, combined with your testimony, effectively reconstructs the accurate record of that mission. Stahl's manufactured narrative collapses without the foundation of a missing parallel debrief, because the parallel debrief isn't missing anymore. You found it. It was where someone told me to find it. The question of who that someone is and why they directed you there is a conversation for after Stahl is in custody." "Agreed." Security came through the south corridor in numbers. 4 personnel moving with the organized purpose of people who'd been given specific information about a specific room and a specific situation. Webb directed them to the sublevel access and followed at a measured distance, the file held against his side. Mara stood in the corridor after they'd gone. The hospital was doing what hospitals did, around and underneath and through everything that had happened in the last hour and a half, continuing. A cart moved past her. An overhead page called a physician to radiology. Somewhere behind her she could hear Deb's voice, calm and managing, running the trauma unit through whatever the trauma unit had in it today. She leaned against the corridor wall and felt, for the first time since the range this morning, the full weight of the last several hours settling into her body. Not dramatically, not in collapse, just in the specific heaviness of tension that had been held for a long time beginning to release by degrees. Her forearm was still bleeding, slowly, the way scrapes did. She'd need to clean and dress it. She'd do that in a few minutes. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number, same format as the previous call. She answered. "He's in custody?" the voice said. "Yes." "Good." A pause. "The document is sufficient." "Who are you?" A longer pause this time, long enough that she thought the line might have gone dead again. "My name is Sergeant First Class David Pellerin," the voice said. "I was LaRue's second. I was 20 meters east of your position when you took the shot." Another pause. "I've been trying to get that file out of this building for 4 months. I couldn't get into the system without triggering an alert. But I knew if I got you to the right room at the right moment." "You used me," she said. "I pointed you at something true," he said. "I didn't put anything in that room that wasn't already there." She was quiet for a moment. "Pellerin," she said, "where are you right now?" A beat. "That's a complicated question," he said. "What I can tell you is that I've been in this building longer than you have." The line was quiet for a moment. "And that I need you to tell Webb something before the debrief. Something I couldn't put in any file." "What?" "Stahl wasn't working alone," Pellerin said. "The civilian in the records room, he's local. But the FOIA filing, the congressional contact, that came from inside JSOMEC. He paused. "Webb has someone inside his own command who has been feeding Stahl information for at least 14 months. Someone who knew you were here before Webb did." The corridor was very quiet. "Pellerin, I have to move," he said. "Tell Webb to look at anyone who had access to relocation routing files 18 months ago. That's how they found you. That's the thread." The line went dead. She stood in the corridor with the phone against her ear and the silence of a cut connection in it, and she understood, with the specific cold clarity of a calculation that had just opened into something much larger than she'd been solving for, that getting Stahl into custody had not ended anything. It had only revealed the shape of what was underneath it. And somewhere in this building, the person who had known she was here for 14 months was still operating and still free, and was now aware, with every second that passed, that the file they'd been protecting had just been found. She straightened up. She walked toward the administration wing at a pace that was not quite running, because running in a hospital corridor drew attention, and she did not want anyone in this building to know what she'd just been told until she was standing in front of Webb and could say it to his face while she watched his reaction. That was not paranoia. That was the lesson of every culvert and every bad room she'd ever walked into and walked out of again. You watched the face of the person you were trusting before you decided whether to trust them. She pushed through the administration wing doors. Webb was at the end of the hall, outside the conference room, on his phone, with his back to her. She was 12 feet away when he turned and saw her coming, and something in his expression shifted. Just slightly, just enough. And she couldn't tell, in that fraction of a second, whether what she was seeing was the shift of a man who was surprised to see her, or the shift of a man who had been waiting to see her and had just been told she was coming. She kept walking. Webb's expression resolved into something readable by the time she was 6 feet away. Not surprise, not guilt, but the focused recalibration of a man who'd just gotten off a call that had changed the information landscape and was now processing what that meant while also processing her approach and the look on her face that told him something had happened since he'd last seen her. "Stahl is in custody," he said. "His associate is being processed by base security. They found a secondary device in the records room. Looks like a remote file deletion trigger, but they got to it before it executed. Whatever Stahl was trying to destroy is still intact. Good, she said. I need to talk to you. That's why I'm standing here. Not in the corridor. He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the conference room door and held it. She went in. She waited until the door was closed behind him, and then she turned and she watched his face while she said it. Pellerin called again. Webb's expression did not shift in the way a guilty man's expression shifted. It shifted in the way of someone receiving information that reorganized something. She'd been watching for the difference and she saw it, or she saw what she believed she saw, which was not the same thing, and she knew that. He told me the FOIA filing didn't originate outside JSOMEC, she said. He told me the congressional contact came from inside your command, someone who had access to relocation routing files 18 months ago. That's how Stahl knew I was here. Someone fed him my location. Webb was quiet. 18 months ago, he said. That's what Pellerin said. Webb moved to the table and set the file down and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at it. Not at her, at the file. She watched him think, not the performance of thinking, but the actual process, which looked like stillness in him rather than movement. 18 months ago, he said again, the Corval records were undergoing a routine access audit. Standard 5-year review. The audit was conducted by 3 officers inside JSOMEC Legal. He looked up. I ran that audit. She held his gaze. I'm on the list, he said. It was not a confession. It was the kind of direct, unsparing acknowledgement that people made when they understood that hiding from a fact was less useful than confronting it. Which means Pellerin's thread, if followed correctly, runs through me as a possibility. Are you? No. He said it without inflection, not defensively, not with the particular emphasis of someone protesting too much, just flatly, as a statement of fact. But I understand why you needed to watch my face when you told me. She said nothing. The other 2 officers on the audit, he said, Major Diane Forsyth, who retired 14 months ago, and Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Ress, who is currently assigned to the JSOMEC Coordinating Office in Washington, and who, I am now realizing, was the officer who first flagged the Corval FOIA request to my attention and suggested I handle the Voss contact personally rather than through standard investigative channels. The room was very quiet. He told you to come here yourself, she said. He told me it was a sensitive matter best handled by someone with direct knowledge of the original mission classification. Webb straightened, which I accepted as a reasonable professional judgment at the time. And now? And now I'm wondering whether it was a reasonable professional judgment or whether it was a way of ensuring that the person investigating the breach was also the person on the list of possible breach sources, which would have created... He stopped. Plausible contamination, she said. If the investigation found anything, it could be routed back to you. Yes. She sat down. It was the second time today she'd sat without deciding to. How much authority does Ress have over the debrief process you're trying to initiate? He'd have to be notified. Standard protocol. So if you initiate a formal debrief that includes the parallel document I found, Ress would know within the hour that Stahl's operation has failed and that a full investigative record is being assembled. Webb's voice was entirely level, which would give him time to manage whatever his exposure looks like. How much time would he need? To sanitize 14 months of routing access? If he's been careful, not much. He looked at her. The question is how careful he's been. She thought about Pellerin, about a man who'd spent 4 months trying to get a physical file out of a building he couldn't enter through normal channels, who'd tracked her to Caldwell Base and watched and waited, and then used the crisis of this specific day, Stahl moving, security activated, Webb on base, to create a window. That was not the behavior of someone working casually. That was the behavior of someone who understood that the opposition was professional and was responding in kind. Pellerin knew about Ress, she said. That's why he called me instead of going through Webb directly. He knew that any official channel ran the risk of hitting Ress first. Can you reach Pellerin again? He calls me. I don't have a number that connects. Webb pulled out his phone. He looked at it for a moment, and then he did something she didn't expect. He powered it off. He set it on the table face down and looked at her. My command communications run through a server infrastructure that Ress has administrative access to. I've been on this phone all morning." He paused. "Whatever I say next, I'm going to say without that phone on." She looked at him. She looked at the phone. "Okay," she said. "I need to initiate the debrief," he said, "in a way that generates an official record of everything we found today. Stall, the parallel file, the manufactured FOIA, the routing breach, before Ress can react to any of it. Which means I need to do it through a channel he doesn't monitor. Does that channel exist? The Inspector General of the Joint Staff has a direct intake process that bypasses JSOM EC internal routing entirely. It's designed for situations where the investigation involves JSOM EC personnel." He paused. "I've never used it. I've never had cause to use it." "You have cause now." "Yes." He looked at the file on the table. "The problem is that the IG intake requires a formal complainant on record, not a subject, not an investigator. A complainant, someone with direct knowledge of the underlying events who is making a formal allegation." She understood where this was going before he finished. "The debrief you wanted," she said, "has just become something more specific," he said. "I need you to file a formal allegation through the IG intake. On record, with your real name, your full name, not Voss, and your complete service history attached. Which means the file that Stahl was trying to use against you becomes, instead, the foundation of the complaint." She was quiet. She understood what he was asking. Her real name attached to a formal IG allegation meant the sealed records, the Corval mission, the 3,000-meter shot, all of it entering a system that was, by design, more transparent than the classification tiers that had kept it buried. It meant the thing she'd spent 14 months hiding from was going to be visible in a way she couldn't walk back. "And if Ress has already moved by the time we file," she said, "then we're documenting what we found and hoping the IG intake is faster than his response." Webb held her gaze. "I'm not going to tell you this is safe. It isn't. I'm going to tell you it's the only path I have that doesn't run through a compromised system." She sat with that for a moment. Outside the conference room, the hospital was continuing. She could hear it. The muted, persistent sounds of a building doing what it was built to do, people being cared for, crises being managed, the ordinary and the urgent running on parallel tracks the way they always did. She'd built 14 months inside that sound. "Get me the IG intake form," she said. Webb didn't have a laptop. He used the conference room's terminal, a standalone hardwired unit that connected to a separate administrative network. And he pulled up the IG direct intake portal and turned the screen toward her and stepped back, because that was the kind of man he was, she was deciding, and she was deciding it carefully. She typed her real name, her service number, her MOS and her deployment record, and the mission she'd been attached to, and then, in the narrative field, the sequence of events beginning with the Corval extraction and running forward through this morning and ending with the name Patrick Ress, and the allegation that a serving officer inside JSOMEC had deliberately routed classified information to a civilian operative, Stahl, for the purpose of constructing a false investigative record against personnel from the Corval mission. It took 22 minutes. She was not a fast typist, and she didn't try to be. She wrote carefully, because a document like this was only as good as its precision, and she'd learned from people who'd taught her well that the most important thing about words in a formal record was that each one was the right word and not an approximation of it. When she was done, she read it through once. Then she hit submit. The confirmation number appeared on the screen, and Webb copied it to a piece of paper, physical paper, pen, the conference room notepad, and put it in his inside jacket pocket. "The IG office will acknowledge within 2 hours," he said. "Once they acknowledge, the case number is in a system that Ress cannot access or modify." "What happens to him between now and 2 hours from now?" "That's the window," Webb said. "That's what we're managing." He picked up his phone and powered it back on and watched it reconnect, and then made a call. Not to Ress, she gathered from the one side of the conversation she could hear. To someone in the IG office directly, a contact he had by memory, a brief and careful call that lasted 90 seconds and ended with him saying, "Confirmed, yes," within the hour, and hanging up. "My contact will flag the intake for priority processing," he said. "It cuts the 2-hour window to 40 minutes. 40 minutes is still a window," Yes. He looked at her. Which is why I need you to stay in this building and stay visible. If Ress has someone watching Caldwell, and given that he knew you were here for 14 months, the probability is that he does. The worst thing that happens right now is that you disappear. She understood the logic. Visible meant accountable. Disappearing, even briefly, meant creating a gap that could be filled with whatever narrative was most convenient. She went back to the trauma wing. It was not a retreat. It was a deliberate positioning, which was different, and she held that distinction clearly in her mind as she pushed through the trauma wing doors and found the unit in the controlled mid-shift rhythm that meant the immediate crises had resolved and the sustained work had taken over. Deb looked at her from the nursing station with the expression of someone who had extensive questions and the professionalism not to ask them all at once. Your GSW critical, Deb said. Out of surgery. Recovery is stable. Good. The patient in Bay 6, the cardiac case, her numbers are better. The incident seems to have, paradoxically, gotten her husband to actually listen to the care team. A pause. He's in base detention. I know. Are you? Deb stopped. Started differently. Is there anything you need right now? Mara looked at her. Deb Richter had been the first person to speak to her on her first day at Harrogate 14 months ago. A brief, practical orientation delivered in the tone of someone who'd done it 40 times and still managed to make it feel specific. She'd been a steady, unglamorous, entirely reliable presence in every shift since. She deserved more honesty than she was going to get right now. I'm okay, Mara said. I need to be here for the next 40 minutes. Can you use me? I can always use you, Deb said. Bay 3 needs a dressing change and a reassessment on pain management. Mara went to Bay 3. The patient was a 26-year-old trainee from the base's combat arms course, a tibial fracture from a training accident 2 days prior. Uncomfortable in the specific way of young men who were accustomed to functioning at full capacity and found any reduction in that capacity personally offensive. His name was Specialist Toron Briggs, and he had the energy of someone who would be a difficult patient for exactly as long as it took him to understand that cooperation was the fastest route to release. She changed his dressing, and he complained about the pressure, and she explained, without commentary, that the pressure was what was keeping the graft edges clean, and he looked at the wound with the expression of someone newly confronting the reality of their own biology. How long? He said. Until what? Until I'm back. She looked at the wound and at the imaging in his chart and gave him the honest answer, which was 8 to 12 weeks for the initial healing phase and another 4 to 6 before full load-bearing training, and watched him absorb that with the particular quiet of someone doing the math on what it meant. That's a long time, he said. It's the time it takes, she said. Fighting it doesn't make it shorter. It usually makes it longer. He was quiet for a moment, then, You're the one from the range this morning. She looked at him. Word gets around, he said. It wasn't defensive. It was just an acknowledgement that military bases were small and permeable, and that what happened at a sniper qualification range at 0600 did not stay at the range. The guys in MAU 7 were talking. Were they? Yeah. He watched her finish the dressing. What they were saying was... He stopped, reconsidered. They were saying they were wrong about you. The initial read. Wrong about what you were. She tied off the dressing. People usually are. Does that bother you? She thought about it. The honest answer was complicated. It bothered her in the way that any persistent misreading bothered someone who'd spent years building competence carefully and invisibly, but it didn't surprise her, and the lack of surprise had its own kind of weariness attached to it. Sometimes, she said, less than it used to. She left him to his arithmetic about recovery timelines and went back to the nursing station. 31 minutes had passed since she'd hit submit on the IG intake. Her phone was in her pocket, on, and she was aware of it the way she was aware of any variable she couldn't control, as a factor, present, requiring monitoring. It rang. The number was one she recognized, the hospital's main administrative line. She answered, Specialist Voss. The voice was male, unhurried, carrying the specific quality of someone who was accustomed to directing situations from a position of institutional authority. This is Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Ress, JSOMEC, Coordinating Office. I understand you've been involved in a significant incident at Caldwell Base today. The nursing station was not private. She turned and walked 3 steps into the medication room corridor, just far enough for distance. "Colonel Ress," she said. "I've been in contact with Colonel Webb about the situation regarding Dr. Stahl," Ress said. "I want to assure you that JSOMEC takes this kind of breach seriously and that you'll have the full cooperation of my office as this investigation develops." She listened to his voice, to the particular construction of each sentence, cooperative, forward-looking, positioned to sound like support rather than management. "I appreciate that," she said. "I also want to address something more specific." A brief pause. Not nervous, calibrated. "I understand that in the course of today's events, some information may have been communicated to you regarding the origin of the Corval records breach. I want to make sure you're aware that those communications may not have come from fully reliable sources." "What communications are those?" "I'm told you received a call from an individual identifying himself as someone with direct knowledge of the Corval mission. I want to flag that unverified individuals with apparent inside knowledge of classified operations are a known vector for disinformation campaigns. The intelligence community has extensive documentation of who told you I received that call," she said. A pause, shorter than the previous one. "Colonel Webb mentioned it in his update," Ress said. She thought about Webb powering off his phone, about the 90-second call he'd made to his IG contact on the powered-on phone after, about the fact that he'd mentioned Pellerin's call in that conversation, or that the conversation had been monitored, or both. "I see," she said. "I just want to make sure you're working with verified information as you move through this process," Ress said. His voice was still smooth, still positioned. "If you have questions about the integrity of any source, my office is available to—" "I'll keep that in mind, Colonel," she said. "Thank you for reaching out." She ended the call. She stood in the medication room corridor for 3 seconds with the phone in her hand, and then she walked back to the nursing station and asked Deb for the location of Commander Mullen, who Deb, with admirable composure, was able to report was currently in the East Corridor in conversation with base security personnel. She found him there. "I need your phone," she said. He looked at her. "My personal phone or my duty phone?" "Personal. And I need you to stay with me while I make the call." He reached into his jacket and handed it over without asking why, which she noted and filed. She called Webb. He answered on the second ring. "Voss? Ress just called me on the hospital line," she said. "He knows about Pellerin's call. He knew within minutes of you making that call to your IG contact." A silence. "My call was on the reconnected phone," Webb said. He said it quietly, with the particular quality of a man who had just watched a mistake he made become a consequence he'd have to manage. "I mentioned Pellerin in passing to establish the urgency of the intake priority." "He's monitoring your communications." "Yes." A beat. "He called you directly." "To establish early contact, to position himself as cooperative, and to flag Pellerin as an unreliable source before I could corroborate anything Pellerin told me. He's managing his exposure. He's been managing it since before you landed at Caldwell," she said. "The question is whether the IG intake got through before he could interfere with the routing." "My contact confirmed receipt," Webb said. "The case number was assigned." "Can Ress access that system?" "The IG intake system is—" Webb stopped. "He shouldn't be able to." "Shouldn't." "No." His voice was careful now. "But if he has access to JSOMEC server infrastructure at the administrative level, and if the IG intake system shares any authentication pathways with—" "Find out," she said. "Right now. Don't use your phone. Use something else." She handed Mullen his phone back. He'd heard enough of the conversation to understand the shape of what was happening, and his face had the expression of someone who had started this morning believing that the most significant professional misjudgment of his day was how he'd treated a nurse in his equipment room, and had since discovered that the day had significantly larger stakes than that. "What do you need?" he said. "The base has a secure communications terminal," she said, "independent of the standard phone infrastructure. Military-grade encryption, separate server pathway." "Where is it?" "Command center," he said. "Second floor, west wing." "Can you get me in?" I can get us both in." They went. The base command center was not dramatic. It was a room of medium size, overlit, with 4 terminals and a wall-mounted display showing base perimeter status, and a duty officer who looked up when they came in with the expression of someone interrupted in the middle of something administrative. "Commander Mullen," the duty officer said. "Sir?" "I need Terminal 2 for a priority communication," Mullen said. "Authorize it." The duty officer authorized it. Webb's IG contact's direct line was a number Webb had given her verbally in the conference room, which she'd committed to memory because she committed numbers to memory the way she committed distances and angles, automatically, without effort, because her brain had been trained to retain things it might need later and had simply never stopped. She dialed. The contact, a woman named Agent Sorrell, efficient and fast, confirmed within 90 seconds that the intake was in the system, case number active, and that the file had been flagged for priority review by the duty IG officer. "Has there been any attempt to access or modify the intake record since submission?" Mara said. A pause. Keyboard sounds. "There are 2 access attempts on the case record in the last 22 minutes, Sorrell said. "Both failed. The file is locked once acknowledged, but the attempts were made from an external IP that our system flagged as a JSOMEC coordinating office address." Mara looked at Mullen. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "That's your corroboration," she said. She gave Sorrell the name. Rank, assignment. She gave her stall and the connection and the routing file access from 18 months ago and the call she'd received 6 minutes ago on the hospital's administrative line. Sorrell was quiet throughout, asking 3 precise questions: dates, communication method, direct quotes where she had them, and then confirmed that the supplemental information would be attached to the existing case record and that the IG duty officer had been briefed. "Timeline for formal action?" Mara said. "Given the nature of the access attempts, this has been escalated to active status," Sorrell said. "The duty officer is contacting the Inspector General directly. Formal notification of the subject of the inquiry will proceed through secure channels within the hour." She ended the call. She sat back from the terminal. Mullen was standing by the door with his arms at his sides and the expression of someone who had watched a sequence of events resolve in a direction he hadn't anticipated when he'd woken up this morning, which was, she thought, a reasonable response to the day he'd had. "Is it done?" he said. "The official part," she said. "The rest takes time." "What's the rest?" "Rest gets formally notified. That triggers a suspension of his access and an investigative hold on his communications. Stahl's custody situation gets handed from base security to federal jurisdiction, which changes what he can be charged with." She stood. "And Webb gets cleared of the access audit contamination because the IG record now documents that the breach originated with Ress and that Webb's involvement was as an investigator, not a source." "And you?" Mullen said. She looked at him. "The Corval record," he said. "The sealed debrief. The 3,000-meter shot." He said it straightforwardly, without the particular performance of casualness that people sometimes deployed when they were asking about something they found impressive. Just directly, as a question about a fact. "What happens to all of that?" "It enters the IG record as documented evidence," she said, "which means it's no longer only in a sealed file. It's in a formal investigative record that contextualizes what it actually was." "Which is what, exactly?" She thought about the culvert, about Toronto on the ground beside her and the 14 people ahead of her, and the ridgeline position, and the one round, and the decision that took less time to make than any decision of that magnitude should reasonably take. "A medical officer," she said, "making the only call available." He nodded, slowly. They walked back through the base toward the hospital. The morning had burned off, and the afternoon was coming in with the particular flat heat that Virginia managed in the summer. Not sharp, just present. The kind of heat that made everything slightly slower and heavier. She could feel it through her scrub top, and she was aware again of the scrape on her forearm that she still hadn't properly dressed. She dressed it when she got back to the trauma wing, In the medication room, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dressed worse things under worse conditions and found the familiar process briefly grounding. Deb found her there. "Webb is asking for you," Deb said. "Administration wing." She finished the dressing and went. Webb was in the corridor outside the conference room, not inside it, and he looked like someone who had spent the last 40 minutes having a difficult time and was managing the aftermath. His jacket was still on. His tie was still straight, but there was something around his eyes that spoke to a sustained effort of the last several hours. "The IG duty officer called me," he said, "directly on a secure line. They've confirmed the case is active. Ress has been notified through his command chain." He paused. "He's been placed on administrative hold pending investigation. His systems access has been suspended." She nodded. "He didn't resist it," Webb said, "which is either because he's genuinely cooperative or because he's had time to prepare for this possibility and knows that resistance at this stage is the wrong move." "What's your read?" "He's been careful for a long time," Webb said. "I think he's going to be careful through the investigation, too. He'll cooperate selectively, produce what he has to produce, and make the case as narrow as possible." "Can he make it narrow enough to walk away?" Webb looked at her. "That depends on what Pellerin has." She understood. The IG record was solid. The routing access, the system breach attempts, Stahl's custody, and the parallel file. But the direct connection between Ress and the manufactured FOIA filing, the specific mechanism of how Stahl had been receiving information, the chain of communication, those threads were thinner than she wanted them to be. "Pellerin knows," she said. "He's been tracking this for months. He has something or he wouldn't have taken the risk of contacting me." "Can you reach him?" "No, he reaches me." She looked at Webb. "But he knew this day was coming. He positioned the records room, he set the timing, he told me exactly what to tell you. He's not done." Webb absorbed that. "If he surfaces—" "I know," she said. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. Same format. Same pattern. She answered. "Ress is in administrative hold," Pellerin said. It wasn't a question. "Good. Here's what you don't have yet." His voice was lower than it had been in the previous calls. Not quieter in volume, but more compressed. The voice of someone operating in a space where noise was a risk. 14 months ago, Ress routed your relocation file to a secondary address. That address belongs to a dead company. Dissolved LLC, nothing on paper. But the LLC's registered agent is a name you'll recognize, Dr. Raymond Stahl. She was very still. "Stahl and Ress have a documented financial relationship," Pellerin said. "Not through JSOMEC, through the LLC. Consulting payments. They predate the Corval FOIA by 2 years. This wasn't reactive. They were building this before they knew where you were. They were building it in case you ever surfaced." "Where is this documented?" she said. "The LLC filing is public record in the state of Virginia. The consulting payments are in Stahl's personal financial records, which Base Security now has access to as part of his custody processing." A pause. "Make sure Webb pulls those records before Stahl's legal representation arrives and starts managing the document production." "Webb," she said, not covering the phone. Webb looked at her. "Stahl's personal financial record," she said. "Base Security has them as part of the custody intake. You need to pull them right now, before his lawyer gets here. Look for consulting payments to or from a dissolved LLC. It'll be a Virginia registration. Registered agent is Stahl himself." Webb was already on his phone. His personal phone, she noticed, not his duty phone, walking toward the east corridor. "You're not going to tell me where you are," she said to Pellerin. "Not yet. But you're close." A pause. "I've been close for a while." "Pellerin." She chose the words deliberately. "The IG record is open. Whatever you have, you can bring it in now. You don't have to keep running this from the outside." A longer silence. "There's one more thing," he said. "Before I come in, Ress had a secondary contact inside Caldwell. Not Stahl. Stahl was external. Someone on base. Someone who was confirming your day-to-day status, your movements, making sure you stayed unaware." He paused.
I'm 90% sure I know who it is, but 90% isn't enough to put a name on a formal record. How do you get to 100? You do something I can't do, he said. You're visible. You're in the building. If Ress's contact knows that the investigation is moving and knows that you know about the secondary contact, they'll move. And when they move, they'll be visible too. She understood what he was describing. It was the oldest mechanism in surveillance work. You couldn't always find the watcher, but you could make the watched person visible enough that the watcher had to choose between staying hidden and reaction was always more visible than stillness. You want me to be bait, she said. I want you to be yourself, Pellerin said. You've been doing that all day. Just keep doing it. The line went dead. She lowered the phone. The corridor was empty except for her, and 40 feet away at the nursing station, Deb Richter running the trauma unit with the particular steady authority that kept a hospital alive through whatever tried to stop it. Mara thought about Pellerin's 90%, about a name she didn't have yet attached to a face she interacted with every day. She'd spent 14 months in this building learning its rhythms, its people, its habits. She'd been invisible to most of them, but visibility was a two-way problem. If she'd been watched for 14 months, then the watcher had habits too. She thought about who knew, this morning, that she'd been called to the equipment inspection. She thought about who knew she'd be at the range at 0600. She thought about the morning's events in sequence, and about the one moment that had always felt slightly displaced from everything around it, the mass casualty alert, which Webb had described as activated to get her back to the hospital quickly, which she'd accepted because it was plausible, but which required someone with the authority and access to activate it on short notice for a non-standard reason. She thought about who had that access. She walked to the nursing station. Deb, she said, the mass casualty alert this morning. Who authorized it? Deb looked up. Admin, she said. It came through the administrative authorization system. I assumed it was the duty administrator. Who's the duty administrator today? Deb checked her screen, turned it toward Mara. The name on the duty roster was not Raymond Stahl. It was the hospital's deputy administrative director, a man named Glenn Farrow, who had been at Harrogate for 3 years, who sat on the base medical committee, who had access to the hospital's alert authorization system, and who had, Mara was now remembering, been in the corridor outside the conference room when she and Webb had emerged from their first conversation about the Corval file. Standing there with a tablet, looking at it, doing nothing in particular, which she'd walked past without registering because hospitals had people standing in corridors doing nothing in particular as a permanent feature of the landscape. She looked at the duty roster. Farrow was currently logged into the hospital's administrative system. She looked at the timestamp on his last system activity. It was 4 minutes ago. He had accessed the hospital's staff location tracking system, the one that logged badge swipes and patient assignment check-ins, and he had, 4 minutes ago, run a location query for a single staff member. Her name. He knew she was in the trauma wing. She straightened up from the screen and turned toward the corridor, and Glenn Farrow was standing at the end of it, 40 feet away, looking directly at her, with the expression of a man who had just understood, in the fraction of a second that their eyes met, that the thing he'd been managing for 14 months had just finished being manageable. For a half-second, neither of them moved. It was the specific stillness of two people who had simultaneously recognized a situation for what it was, stripped of the pretense that had been maintaining it, and were now standing on opposite sides of something that couldn't be walked back. Farrow was 40 feet away, and his face was doing the particular work of a man running calculations. Not panicking, not fleeing, but assessing. She'd seen that look before. It was the look of someone deciding whether the move they'd prepared for this moment was still the right move now that the moment had actually arrived. She didn't give him time to finish deciding. She walked toward him. Not running. Walking. Steady, direct, covering the 40 feet at a pace that was faster than casual and slower than chase, because running meant urgency, and urgency could be argued with. But a straight, deliberate walk towards someone in a hospital corridor had the specific social gravity of inevitability, and she wanted him to feel that gravity for every one of those 40 feet. His eyes tracked her, and she watched his hands, both visible, tablet in the right, left at his side.
and she watched his weight shift slightly backward and then stop, because he'd caught himself on the edge of stepping back and understood what stepping back would look like. "Specialist Voss," he said when she was 10 feet away. "Glenn," she said. He registered the use of his first name the same way Stahl had, as pressure, as a refusal of the institutional distance that titles provided. His jaw tightened by a fraction. "I was just reviewing the staff coverage logs for the incident response this morning," he said. "Standard administrative follow-up. You ran a location query on me 4 minutes ago. I run location queries on all, my name, specifically, 4 minutes ago." She stopped 4 feet from him. After the IG case number was assigned, and after Ress was placed on administrative hold, something shifted in his face. Not collapse? Not yet. But the particular shift of a man whose prepared script had just hit a line that wasn't in it. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said. "You authorized the mass casualty alert this morning," she said, "not because of a mass casualty event, because you needed me back in this building before I had an unsupervised conversation with Colonel Webb at the range. You needed to control the environment." She watched him. "That's not a guess, Glenn. That's a sequence." His breathing had changed, shallow, faster. "I authorized the alert based on the GSW reports that came through at... The GSW reports came through at 0712, she said. The alert was activated at 0704, 8 minutes before the reports that supposedly triggered it." She let that land. "The system timestamps don't lie. They're in the administrative record that base security pulled as part of Stahl's custody intake, the same record that shows your authorization code on the alert." He looked at the tablet in his hand. It was a reflex, the gesture of someone reaching for the tool they'd been using to manage situations, before remembering that the tool was itself evidence. She reached out and took it from him. He didn't resist. That was the tell. The specific non-resistance of someone who had crossed the threshold between managing a situation and being managed by it and knew, in this moment, exactly which side of that threshold they were on. "I need you to stay here," she said. "Right here. Don't go anywhere." She turned and walked to the nursing station and picked up the desk phone. Not her cell, the hardwired desk phone that ran on the hospital's internal system and that Glenn Farrow did not have administrative access to monitor. And called the base security duty desk and said 4 sentences in the flat, specific language of someone reporting a factual situation without editorial, and then she set the phone down and turned back. Farrow had not moved. He was standing in the corridor where she'd left him, and he looked for the first time since she'd walked toward him, like someone who was very tired. Not frightened. Tired. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding a position for a long time and has just been released from the effort of holding it, even though the release was not the kind they'd been working toward. She walked back to him and stood there while they waited, and she didn't say anything else because there was nothing useful left to say, and because the silence was honest and the talking would not have been. Base security arrived in 4 minutes. They were professional about it, low-key, efficient, the minimum visible disruption in an active medical facility. 2 personnel, a brief exchange with Farrow that she didn't insert herself into, and then he was moving with them toward the security office, and the corridor was just a corridor again, the hospital doing what it did, the afternoon pressing on. Deb appeared at her shoulder. "Do I want to know?" Deb said. "Probably not right now," Mara said. "Okay." A pause. "Bay 1 needs a medication check." She went to Bay 1. She did the medication check. Buds. Webb found her an hour later in the break room, which was empty except for her and a half pot of coffee that had been sitting on the burner long enough to be aggressively inadvisable. She poured a cup of it anyway and was sitting at the table with it untouched in front of her when he came in. He sat down across from her. He looked like someone who had spent the last hour on phones and in rooms and making decisions, which was accurate. And he had the particular quality of a man arriving at a conversation he'd been preparing for during all of that. "Farrow," he said. "Yes." "He's talking," Webb said. "He started talking before his legal representation arrived, which is not the smartest thing he's ever done, but it's producing useful information quickly." He put his hands flat on the table. His connection to Ress predates his posting at Harrogate. Ress recruited him specifically for this assignment. Farrow applied for the deputy director position here after a conversation with Ress about its value. 3 years of watching, reporting, being the eyes inside the building. For a contingency, she said. In case I surfaced. In case you surfaced, he confirmed. Ress built an entire contingency architecture around the possibility that the Corval records would become a problem. Stahl as the document operative, Farrow as the surveillance asset, the LLC as the financial insulation, the FOIA filing as the opening move. He paused. It was thorough. It just didn't account for Pellerin, or for the fact that Stahl kept the parallel file in a physical record instead of destroying it. Stahl kept it, Webb said, because he believed it supported his version of events. He wasn't hiding it. He was preserving it as his own evidence. He intended to surface it on his terms, at the moment most useful to his narrative. And instead, I found it on mine. Yes. A pause. Pellerin knew Stahl well enough to know he'd keep the physical file. That's why he directed you to record storage. Webb looked at her. Pellerin was in that building, by the way, sub-level 1, not record storage, the utility corridor adjacent to it. He was there when you went in, and when the situation with Stahl's associate escalated, he was the one who disabled the secondary file deletion device before security arrived. She absorbed that. He was there the whole time, she said. He's been at Caldwell Base for 9 days, Webb said. Civilian contractor credential, a company that exists and has legitimate contracts and also, it turns out, employs several former special operations personnel who do exactly this kind of work when they're not doing anything else. He met her eyes. He's outside. He'd like to talk to you, if you're willing. She looked at the untouched coffee. Yeah, she said. Okay. Pellerin was standing outside the hospital's east entrance in the afternoon heat, in civilian clothes, dark pants, a gray shirt, the particular way of standing that never fully left people who'd spent years in environments where standing correctly meant something. He was 40 or so, lean, with a scar along the left side of his jaw that she recognized as a burn scar, and not the kind that came from anything other than what it came from. She'd never met him. She'd known he was 20 meters east of her in a culvert 3 years ago, and she'd known his name in a file, and now she was looking at his face and finding in it the specific kind of recognizability that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with having been in the same place at the same time, doing the same impossible accounting of who was left. He looked at her the same way. Neither of them said anything for a moment. You could have contacted Webb directly 3 months ago, she said finally. I could have, he said. But I wasn't certain, 3 months ago, that Webb wasn't part of it. I needed to see how he handled the contact with you, whether he ran it straight or whether he ran it to the side. And? He ran it straight. A pause. He's a good officer. He just trusted the wrong person's judgment about the chain of custody. Ress pointed him at me so that if anything surfaced, Webb was the investigating officer with a contaminated access history. Yes. Pellerin squinted slightly against the afternoon sun. Ress has been careful for a very long time. He's going to be careful through the investigation. He'll give up Stahl completely. Stahl's already giving him up, so there's no loyalty to protect there. And he'll minimize his own role as administrative in nature. Oversight. Coordination. Nothing that pulls a trigger. Will that work? The LLC is the problem for him, Pellerin said. 2 years of consulting payments to a company that has Stahl as its registered agent and that was created 8 months after the Corval debrief was sealed. The financial record doesn't look administrative. It looks like payment for services. He looked at her steadily. The IG will find what's there. It'll take time, but it'll hold. She looked at him. What do you want out of this? He seemed slightly surprised by the directness of it, but not put off by it. The accurate record, he said. That's all I've wanted since I figured out what Ress was building. LaRue is dead. Toronto is dead. The 6 people who went home from that valley went home because of decisions that are documented, right now, in a formal investigative record as unauthorized and actionable. I want that record corrected before it calcifies. It's in the IG file. The parallel debrief is in the IG file, he said. Your statement is in the IG file, but the sealed debrief, the original, is still sealed. And sealed records have a way of staying sealed unless someone with the authority to unseal them decides to. She understood what he wasn't quite asking. Webb, she said. Webb can petition for declassification through the IG process now that there's a formal investigative record that references the sealed material. He can't do it unilaterally, but he can initiate it. He paused. He'll need the request to come from you, the subject of the sealed material. She was quiet for a moment. The afternoon was doing what Virginia afternoons did, pressing down, flat and warm, the kind of weather that made everything feel slightly more consequential than it might otherwise. She thought about the sealed file, about 14 months of being Mara Voss in a trauma wing, competent and invisible, the file existing somewhere in a system she couldn't access or affect or answer to. She thought about the fact that it had found her anyway. I'll make the request, she said. Pellerin nodded. Not with relief, just with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who'd run a long operation and had arrived at the outcome they were running it toward without any particular fanfare, because the outcome was not a victory so much as a correction. There's one more thing, he said. The IG process is going to surface your full record, the real one. Your service history, the Corval mission, the engagement at 3,200 meters. He looked at her directly. You've been a trauma nurse in a hospital in Kerith, Virginia for 14 months. That's about to stop being the whole story. It was never the whole story, she said. No, he agreed. But it was the story you'd chosen. I want to make sure you know that what comes next, you don't have to manage it the same way you've been managing it. You don't have to be invisible anymore. She looked at him for a long moment, the scar along his jaw, the way he stood. The 9 days he'd spent inside a contractor credential at a base where the wrong people knowing he was there would have ended what he was trying to do. You weren't invisible either, she said. No, he said, but I had a company to hide behind. Something in his expression shifted. Not humor exactly, but adjacent to it. You had scrubs in a quiet hallway and 14 months of making yourself unremarkable. That's harder, honestly. She looked at the hospital behind her, the east entrance, the brick facade, the windows of the trauma wing visible on the second floor. I wasn't trying to be unremarkable, she said. I was trying to be a nurse. You're a hell of a nurse, he said. That's also in the record. What? The formal investigative proceedings moved with the particular institutional velocity of things that had been waiting to move and had just been given the mechanism to do so. Ress was suspended from duty within 24 hours of the IG case being assigned active status. The suspension was administrative. No public announcement, no press release, but it was complete, and his systems access, his communications, and his physical access to JSOMEC facilities were revoked simultaneously and without warning, which was the IG's standard practice for cases involving potential destruction of evidence, and which Ress had not, despite his carefulness, fully prepared for. He did not, in the end, manage the situation as cleanly as Pellerin had predicted. The LLC was the problem, as Pellerin had said it would be. 2 years of structured payments that a financial forensics team took 11 days to fully document, and that told a story that no amount of careful cooperation could reframe as administrative coordination. The payments had started 8 months after Corval. They had increased twice, once when the FOIA filing was initiated, once when Mara had been located at Caldwell Base. Payment for outcomes. That was the phrase the forensic summary used. Payment for outcomes was not a phrase that supported the narrative of an officer performing oversight. Stahl's federal charges were filed in the 4th week. Obstruction of a federal investigation, filing a fraudulent congressional inquiry, unauthorized access and manipulation of classified records, and conspiracy, a list that his legal representation reviewed with the expression of people looking at a structural problem rather than a manageable one. He cooperated, as expected. His cooperation was useful and was credited as it would be, which meant the sentencing calculus changed, but the conviction calculus did not. Farrow's situation was handled separately. He had not participated in document manipulation or the financial architecture. His role had been surveillance, authorization misuse, and information relay, which were serious but distinct from what Ress and Stahl had done. He cooperated fully from the first hour, which his legal representation characterized as remorse, and which was probably also pragmatism, and the two things were not mutually exclusive. The sealed Corval debrief was declassified through the IG process in the 6th week, following Mara's formal petition and Webb's supporting documentation. It was not a dramatic event, no announcement, no press release, just a status change in a classification system that meant a document that had existed in one kind of silence now existed in a different kind. The document itself, read alongside the parallel debrief and Mara's IG testimony and Pellerin's supplemental statement, produced a record of the Corval extraction that was coherent and complete and accurate, and that described, in the flat specific language of military documentation, a medical officer who had performed a 3,200-meter engagement under emergency conditions following the incapacitation of the mission's command authority, which engagement had been the proximate cause of the successful extraction of 14 personnel. 14 people went home. It was in the record now. Webb came to Harrogate on a Tuesday morning in the 7th week and met Mara in the conference room, the same one they'd first used, the narrow room with the one window looking at the parking structure. And he put a folder on the table, not a red tab folder, a blue one. "This is a formal offer," he said, "from JSOMEC through the IG office as part of the case resolution. It's not a requirement, it's not leverage, it's an offer, and you can decline it." She opened the folder. The document inside was a restoration of rank, her actual rank, the one that had been effectively paused when she'd taken her discharge and her sealed file and her new name and her trauma unit position, and an appointment to a new role, not a field role, not classified operations. A formal position within the military medical training infrastructure, Director of Combat Trauma Integration, a joint program between JSOMEC and the Army Medical Training Command that was responsible for developing and delivering advanced trauma training to special operations medical teams. She read it through. "It's a real position," Webb said, "not ceremonial, not created for optics. It exists because the gap between what combat medics are trained to do and what they actually encounter in the field is significant, and there are very few people with the specific combination of credentials to address that gap in a meaningful way." "Who decided on the appointment?" "Several people," he said. "I was one of them. Pellerin submitted a formal recommendation. The IG duty officer who processed the case wrote a supporting memo." He paused. "And the 6 surviving members of the Corval extraction submitted a joint letter." She looked up. "I wasn't aware they'd been in contact with each other," she said. "They've been in contact since the case became active," Webb said. "Pellerin organized it. He reached out to each of them individually. They wrote the letter without coordination through any official channel. They just wrote it." He held her gaze. "You should read it when you're ready. It's not in the folder. It's a separate document. I have it." She closed the folder. She sat with it for a moment. The thing about being invisible for 14 months was that it became gradually not just a strategy but a habit of self. You stopped expecting to be seen accurately. You built your days around the version of yourself that the environment was equipped to understand, and the rest of it, the parts that didn't fit, the parts that were too large or too specific or too shaped by things other people hadn't experienced, you carried quietly and didn't put down because there was nowhere to put it. She was very tired of carrying it. "I'll take the position," she said. Webb nodded. He did not perform relief or satisfaction. He just nodded, the way a person nodded when something they believed was right had been confirmed. "There's a formal ceremony," he said. "Restoration of rank is a documented process. The base commander here has offered Caldwell as the location, given that the events initiating the investigation occurred here." He paused. "You can decline the ceremony if you want. It's not required." She thought about it. She thought about the equipment room. About 43 personnel and the specific quality of that laughter, the weight of it, the way it had sat on her shoulders for the 8 hours afterward without ever quite landing as surprise, because she'd heard versions of it before and had long since stopped expecting anything different. She thought about Specialist Briggs in Bay 3, asking how long it would take to get back. She thought about the answer she'd given him, the honest one, the time it takes. Schedule the ceremony, she said. It was a Thursday morning, clear, the summer heat finally breaking into something that felt more like early fall. The air with edges again, the light coming in at an angle that was different from July. The Caldwell Base parade ground held more people than Mara had expected. Not a vast assembly, this was not that kind of occasion, but more than a formal procedural event typically drew. The MAU-7 personnel in formation, base command staff, Webb and Pellerin standing together near the front, and a cluster of people she didn't immediately recognize until she looked more carefully and understood that they were the surviving members of the Corval extraction, who had traveled from 4 different states to stand in a row on a parade ground in Virginia on a Thursday morning for a ceremony that most of them had not been officially informed about through any standard channel. Pellerin had organized that too, she suspected. Deb Richter was there. She was standing at the back in her civilian clothes, looking slightly out of place in the way of someone who'd come somewhere outside their usual geography, and was okay with that. She caught Mara's eye and made no gesture, just held her gaze for a moment, which was its own kind of language. Commander Mullen was in formation with his unit. He'd requested, through Webb, the opportunity to address the assembly as part of the ceremony, a request that Webb had relayed to Mara, and that she'd agreed to after a moment of consideration, because she understood what he was trying to do, and she believed he understood what it needed to cost him to do it. He stepped forward when the base commander nodded. He spoke for 4 minutes. It was not a long speech, and it was not an eloquent speech, and it was better for being neither of those things. He described the morning in the equipment room without softening it, the comment that had been made, the order to wait outside, the specific texture of his dismissal of someone he hadn't taken the time to understand. He said that he'd been wrong, and that wrong in a command position had a specific gravity that wrong in other contexts didn't have, because it set the tone for the people watching. He said that the operators in his unit were better than the behavior they demonstrated that morning, and that he intended to carry the responsibility for that as a command failure and not distribute it. He did not perform contrition. He stated it. When he finished, he stepped back into formation and stood straight and did not look anywhere for a response. The base commander stepped forward. The ceremony itself was brief. The formal language of rank restoration was specific and procedural, and she stood through it without shifting her weight and listened to each word with the attention she gave to anything that mattered, which was complete attention, the kind that didn't perform itself. When the base commander read the citation for the appointment, he read it in full, including the line about the Corval extraction, including the engagement distance, including the 14 survivors. He read it without commentary, which was correct, because the facts didn't need commentary, and the people present who understood what those facts meant understood them, and the people who didn't would learn. She received the rank insignia from the base commander's hands, and she held still while it was placed, and she did not look away from the middle distance in the way of people managing an emotion they don't want to be seen managing. She just stood there and let it happen, and felt, underneath the formality of the moment, the specific weight of something that had been withheld for 3 years being returned. Not given. Returned. That distinction mattered to her, and she held it. When the commander stepped back and the formation held the moment of stillness that preceded its breaking, something happened that had not been planned or coordinated or included in any protocol. The MAU-7 operators in formation came to attention simultaneously, not on a command, not on a signal she could see. They just did it, the way people did things when the agreement was understood without being stated, and they stood there at attention and looked forward, and the gesture had the specific quality of people acknowledging something they couldn't articulate through language and had found a different way to say. Mullen, at their front, was the first. Pellerin, at the side of the ground, brought his hand up. The Corval survivors, one by one, did the same. She returned the salute. Not to the rank or the ceremony or the crowd of them. To the 3 years in a culvert and a record room and a trauma wing and every corridor in between, to Toronto who hadn't made it out, and LaRue who hadn't made it out, and the 14 who had, to the version of herself she'd folded carefully away for 14 months and was now, without fanfare, unfolding. C. She started the Director of Combat Trauma Integration role on a Monday morning in October. Her office was in the training complex on the north side of Caldwell,
a room of functional size with 2 windows and a whiteboard, and a desk that had been used by someone else before her, and showed the evidence of it in a scatter of pen marks and a drawer that stuck. She didn't fix the drawer. She had the sense that the drawer had a character of its own that she wasn't going to fight. Her first trainee cohort was 12 combat medics, ages 22 to 31, from 3 different special operations units, none of whom knew exactly what to expect from a director whose job title was new and whose background had just become, through the IG declassification, technically public record in the specific way that classified information became public when it stopped being classified. They knew the record. She could see it in how they arranged themselves in the room for the first session, the particular attention of people who'd read something and were now looking at the person it described. She let them look. She stood at the front of the room and looked back, and then she said, "Here's what we're going to do in this program. We're going to train for what actually happens, not for what the scenario assumes. The gap between those two things is where people die." She looked at each of them in turn. "You're going to leave this program with the reflex, not just the knowledge, and that's going to take longer than you think it will and be harder than you think it will, and I'm not going to apologize for either of those things." No one spoke. "Questions before we start?" One of them, 23 years old, with the particular alertness of someone who processed quickly and knew it, raised her hand. "The Corval engagement," she said. "The shot at 3,200 meters. Were you scared?" The room was very quiet. Mara considered the question, not as a performance of consideration, but because it deserved an honest answer, and honest answers sometimes required a moment. "Yes," she said. "I was scared." She looked at the young medic. "I was also the only one with the position and the round and the decision to make." Fear was present. It didn't get a vote. The young medic nodded slowly. The nod of someone writing something down in the part of themselves where the things that matter get written. "That's what we're training," Mara said. "Not the absence of fear, the management of it. The space between feeling something and letting it make your decisions for you." She moved to the whiteboard. "That space is a skill. You can build it. Let's start." She uncapped the marker. Outside the window, Caldwell Base continued. The parade ground was empty at this hour, the morning light coming across it at the angle that made the grass look briefly silver before it turned green. Somewhere across the base, she knew, the IG investigation was continuing its slow institutional work. Ress's case building toward a resolution that would take months and produce consequences that would be documented in language she'd never read because it wasn't her language to read. Stahl's charges were moving through a process that didn't require her attention. Farrow had agreed to a plea arrangement that reduced his exposure in exchange for a complete record of everything he'd reported, to whom and when. The machinery of accountability was slow and imperfect and often unsatisfying in its pace, and it was moving. She'd learned over the years to distinguish between things that required her direct action and things that required her to trust a process and redirect her attention. The first kind kept you sharp. The second kind was harder because it asked you to put down something you'd been carrying and walk away from it and believe that the walking away was the right move. She'd been practicing the walking away for a long time. She was getting better at it. There was something she'd thought about in the weeks between the ceremony and this first Monday morning, something she'd turned over in the specific quiet of late evenings in her apartment off base, the duct-taped truck in the parking lot, and the habit of standing in doorways half a second longer than other people, and all the accumulated texture of a life that had been shaped by things most people never had to account for. What she'd thought about was this. The people who had dismissed her had not been entirely wrong about what they saw. They had seen a woman in scrubs. They had seen a trauma nurse. They had seen someone unremarkable in an institutional context, someone who fit the category, someone who presented no information that required revision of their assumptions. They had been wrong about what that meant. But the error was understandable. Humans read categories. Humans use available information. The failure wasn't in the reading. The failure was in the certainty, in the refusal to hold the reading loosely enough to revise it when new information arrived. That was the thing she was going to teach, she realized, in every session she ran and every medic she trained. Not just trauma protocols, not just tactical response, but the discipline of revision,
The specific, difficult, ongoing practice of being wrong about something and updating instead of defending. It was what medicine required. It was what the field required. It was, in the end, what every difficult situation required of the people inside it. She'd learned it in the hardest possible classroom. She was going to teach it in a better one. On the whiteboard behind her, she wrote 3 words. Not a title, not a heading, just a reminder. For them, and also for herself. Because the people who stopped needing reminders were people who'd stopped paying attention. See, revise, act. Write that down, she said. We'll come back to it every day. She turned to the room. 12 faces. 12 people at the beginning of something. All of them carrying already the particular weight of having chosen work that mattered and knowing what that choice was going to cost them, in ways large and small and unforeseeable for the rest of their careers. She knew that weight. She'd carried it across 2 continents and 3 years of silence and 14 months of being someone smaller than she was. She was done being smaller than she was. All right, she said. Let's go.